The Atlantic Slave Trade? What schools never told you. The Transatlantic Slave Trade, a dark chapter in human history, spanned centuries and continents. Do you really think you know everything there is to know about it? Well, get ready, because what you're about to uncover might just make you rethink everything you thought you knew about one of humanity's greatest tragedies. The stories schools never told you. This video will delve into the horrifying scale, the complex roles of all parties involved, and the lasting legacy of this brutal system. Join us as we unveil the truth, the horrifying truth about the transatlantic slave trade. Slavery in various forms has existed throughout human history across the globe. From ancient civilizations to powerful empires, this form of human ownership has seeped into social structures. However, when we talk about the transatlantic slave trade, we are referring to an entirely different phenomenon, one that stands out not only for its unprecedented global scale, but also for the devastating, long-lasting legacy it left for centuries to come. This isn't just a simple historical chapter, it's a global tragedy, an indelible scar on the conscience of humanity. Let's look at the numbers to truly grasp the horror. From 1500 to 1880 CE, a period spanning nearly 4 centuries, an estimated 10 to 12 million Africans were forcibly transported from their homelands across the Atlantic Ocean to the Americas. This number isn't just a statistic. It represents millions of lives stolen, millions of families shattered, millions of souls crushed under the weight of brutality and lost freedom. Every single number within that count is a tragic story, a dream crushed, a hope buried. And these are just the people who survived the initial raids and were forced onto ships. The transoceanic journey, known as the Middle Passage, was a living hell. During this horrific voyage, an estimated 15% of them, equivalent to 1.5 million people, perished. They died from disease, starvation, unimaginable living conditions, violence, and utter despair. Their bodies, without a shred of mercy, were thrown into the ocean, becoming food for sharks, turning the Atlantic into a massive collective grave. But the tragedy didn't stop there. The 10 to 12 million people brought to the Americas and the 1.5 million who died at sea do not even include millions of other Africans who were killed in their homelands during raids, plundering, and brutal slave hunting wars instigated by European slavers and other African participants. Entire communities and villages were annihilated, populations severely decimated, and social structures torn apart by constant chaos and violence. The enslaved people who survived and reached the Americas were not greeted with freedom, but with a reality even more brutal than death. They were taken to slave markets where they were sold like livestock, nothing more, nothing less. Their value was determined by their health, age, and labor capacity, completely stripping them of all human dignity. And to assert their absolute ownership, cruel enslavers often branded their cheeks with hot iron, a dehumanizing act designed to turn a human being into an object, a material asset that could be traded and sold. That scar was not just etched onto their flesh, but deeply carved into their souls, a symbol of domination and self-loss. Their lives in the Americas were nothing short of a long, drawn-out string of labor and terror. They were stripped of everything: their personal identity, culture, families, and even their very souls. Their daily life was a never-ending cycle of forced labor, deprived of all basic rights. They were stripped naked, whipped mercilessly, and forced to work incredibly long hours under harsh weather conditions, often in terrible health due to malnutrition, disease, and exhaustion. One of the most shocking truths about slavery is about life expectancy. The average life expectancy of an enslaved person in the Americas was incredibly short, only about 21 to 22 years old. Imagine a person born, living in harsh conditions, and having their life taken after just 2 decades of existence. This reveals the horrific level of exploitation and medical neglect they endured. And this tragedy continued for generations. Approximately 50% of enslaved infants died within their first year of life. This number reflects a system that was not only brutal to adults, but also stole the future of tiny lives before they could even experience life. This was not accidental. It was a direct consequence of a system built on cruelty and the disregard for human life. Origins and role of Europe. To better understand how the tragedy of the transatlantic slave trade exploded and shaped history, we need to go back to the early 16th century, when European powers began to set foot and establish colonies in the New World. In the early 1500s, Portugal and Spain, two pioneering empires in the age of exploration, led the conquest and colonization of the Americas. Their goal was clear: to exploit abundant natural resources, especially gold, silver, and valuable agricultural products. Initially, to meet the enormous labor demands on newly established plantations and mines, these conquerors forced indigenous Americans into slavery. However, their plan quickly encountered a major obstacle. Diseases from Europe, to which the indigenous people had no immunity, swept through communities, causing mass deaths. In addition, the Europeans' brutal conquest violence also significantly contributed to the decline of the enslaved indigenous population. The result was a severe labor shortage that emerged, threatening the immense profits that the colonies promised. This was when Europeans, with their insatiable desire for wealth and power, turned to Africa to seek a new labor source, one that seemed inexhaustible and more sustainable. Initially, Spain even made moves to restrict the direct transportation of African enslaved people to its colonies. The stated reason was their fear that these Africans, considered savage, would corrupt established European society. This sounds ironic, as it was the Europeans themselves who were committing some of the most barbaric acts in history. However, all moral or social barriers quickly collapsed when economic reasons prevailed. The demand for cheap, resilient labor to work in the sugar, tobacco, and cotton industries became the top priority. In 1518, a groundbreaking decision was made. King Charles V of Spain officially granted a license for the transportation of 4,000 enslaved people directly from Africa to Spanish colonies. This was a horrific milestone, marking the beginning of a new era in the slave trade, and it led to the uncontrollable explosion of the transatlantic slave trade. This decision opened the door to a massive labor market where human beings were turned into commodities and profit was prioritized above all else. European slave traders, with the complicity of political and military powers, quickly established a complex network to gather and transport enslaved people. They assembled and imprisoned those captured at stronghold forts built along the African coast, before forcing them onto terrifying ships to be taken to the Americas. These forts, now chilling historical relics, once held millions of souls, witnessing countless pains and despair before they were forced onto the fateful ships. To better understand how the transatlantic slave trade system operated, we need to learn about the triangular trade system. This was a three-legged economic model forming a brutal, yet extremely economically efficient cycle for European powers. First leg. European ships departed from their ports, laden with goods such as weapons, textiles, and alcohol. These goods, though seemingly harmless, were in fact deadly tools used to exchange for enslaved people in Africa. Weapons, especially guns, shifted the balance of power among African tribes, fueling wars and the capture of prisoners, thereby creating a plentiful supply of enslaved people. Textiles and alcohol also played a significant role in satisfying consumption demands and weakening social structures. Second leg, the Middle Passage. After exchanging goods for human beings, these ships would be filled with enslaved Africans destined for the Americas and West Indies. This was the most horrific stage where millions of people endured inhumane living conditions and faced imminent death. Enslaved people were considered live cargo, packed tightly together like parcels with the sole purpose of arriving safely at their destination to be sold at a high price. Third leg. After selling all the enslaved people in the Americas and West Indies, European ships would be loaded with raw materials such as sugar, coffee, tobacco, rice, and cotton, all produced on plantations by the labor of enslaved people, to be transported back to Europe. These materials would then be processed into consumer products, generating immense profits for European factories and merchants. This system demonstrated a brutal but efficient division of labor for those who benefited. Europe provided capital, Africa provided labor, and the Americas provided land and resources. This viciously symbiotic relationship generated enormous profits for the participating European and American nations, while consolidating their economic and political power globally. The wealth of many major European and American cities today has deep roots in this slave trade system. A lesser-known but extremely important aspect of the triangular trade was the global connectivity it created. The slave trade wasn't just a closed circuit between three continents. It was an essential bridge between European trade with the New World and trade with Asia. For example, French ships brought cowrie shells, a major currency widely used in West Africa, and Indian textiles from Asia to Africa to exchange for enslaved people. This shows the complex and comprehensive nature of the global trade network that was built on human blood and suffering. Many nations and regions played pivotal roles in the transatlantic slave trade. The leading nations involved in this barbaric trade included Portugal, England, France, the Netherlands, Spain, the United States, and Denmark. Each nation had major seaports, powerful trading companies, and laws supporting slavery to maximize profits. The main regions in Africa heavily ravaged by slave raiding included Senegambia, Sierra Leone and the Windward Coast, the Gold Coast, the Bight of Benin, the Bight of Biafra, and West Central Africa, Congo, and Angola. These areas suffered severe population decline, political instability, and centuries of social structure destruction. The coastlines of present-day nations like Togo, Benin, and Nigeria were even called the Slave Coast due to the excessive and brutal slave trade that occurred there. That name remains a permanent reminder of the painful past, a time when human lives were worth no more than a commodity. Slave life and dehumanization. After being captured in their African homelands and imprisoned in coastal forts, abducted Africans faced the utmost horror, the Middle Passage. This was not just a sea voyage. It was a journey into an earthly hell, lasting from 3 to 6 months, an agonizingly long period of suffering and death. Even the sailors on these ships were not immune to risk. The mortality rate for sailors also reached 20%, showing the harshness and danger of the voyage, not just for the enslaved, but also for those involved in this brutal system. Conditions on slave ships were completely inhumane. Enslaved people were crammed below deck in cramped, damp, dark, and suffocating spaces, rarely getting a chance to go out on deck for fresh air or sunlight. Imagine the suffocating crowding. An adult man was only allotted a space of just 6 feet, about 1.8 meters in length, and 1 foot 4 inches, about 40 centimeters, in width. Women received 5 feet, 1.5 meters, by 1 foot 4 inches, 40 centimeters, and girls even less, 4 feet 6 inches, 1.37 meters, by 1 foot, 30 centimeters. They lay packed shoulder to shoulder in scorching heat, in a stuffy space, reeking of filth, human waste, sweat, blood, and disease. The stench was so pungent it could be detected from afar, signaling the presence of these death ships. Hunger and thirst were their inevitable companions. Enslaved people were only given 24 ounces of water per day, equivalent to 2 12-ounce soda cans today, an insufficient amount of water to sustain life in high temperatures and unsanitary conditions. Their main food was horse beans and rice, minimal, severely malnourished rations, insufficient to provide energy for their exhausted bodies. They were chained hand and foot, sometimes chained to each other, packed tightly on the various decks, unable to move or turn comfortably. This not only caused physical pain, but was also a form of psychological control, stripping away all personal freedom. The journey also faced uncontrolled disease outbreaks, pirate attacks, and constant physical, sexual, and psychological abuse from traders and sailors. The screams, the sound of whips, the groans of the sick, and the gasps of the dying mingled together, creating a horrifying symphony of suffering. An estimated 15 to 25% of enslaved Africans died during this fateful journey. Each death is damning evidence of humanity's boundless brutality. After hearing about the horrifying conditions on slave ships, what haunts you the most? Is it the extreme dehumanization or history's silence about that suffering? Upon reaching the Americas, a common misconception often arises that enslaved Africans were merely unskilled laborers, people who could only do heavy manual work. However, the truth is entirely the opposite. They were highly skilled tailors, carpenters, blacksmiths, builders, cooks, and many other professionals. They brought their traditional knowledge and skills from Africa, contributing to building the economy and infrastructure of the New World. Work on plantations, where most enslaved people were forced to toil, was neither simple nor easy. On the contrary, it was extremely difficult and required meticulousness, patience, and extraordinary endurance. Think of cultivating sugarcane, cotton, tobacco, crops that demanded continuous care from planting, weeding, and harvesting to processing. Especially when harvesting sugarcane, an incredibly arduous and dangerous job, enslaved people could be forced to work continuously for 48 hours without sleep, in sweltering heat and under the brutal supervision of overseers. They were compelled to work 10 months a year from dawn until dusk, with almost no time for rest or recovery. Beyond all physical suffering was mental dehumanization. The transatlantic slave trade was not merely a form of forced labor, it was chattel slavery. This meant that enslaved people were considered personal property, no different from livestock or objects, and had absolutely no human rights whatsoever. They had no right to legal marriage, no right to own property, no right to education, no right to freedom of movement. Their lives were entirely in the hands of their enslavers, who held the power of life and death over them. One of the darkest aspects of this dehumanization was the frequent sexual abuse of enslaved women by enslavers. This was not just for personal gratification, but also to force them to reproduce, thereby increasing profits through producing more enslaved people. The consequence of this barbaric behavior is a shocking genetic truth. Approximately 16.7% of African Americans' ancestry today can be traced back to Europe, clear evidence of centuries of sexual abuse and forced miscegenation. Even enslaved people fortunate enough to work in the house, whose lives seemed less physically demanding, were not spared from brutality. They endured constant physical and psychological violence from both the master and his wife. These forms of violence could include beatings, insults, threats, or sophisticated punishments aimed at breaking their will. Their lives were a perpetual state of fear and tension, devoid of safety or compassion. The complex role of Africans. When discussing the transatlantic slave trade, a difficult but necessary truth to confront is that Africans also participated in the slave trade. This is an aspect often overlooked or downplayed in history, but it's crucial for a comprehensive understanding. Often it was stronger African groups who captured and sold other African groups to European traders. The purpose of this was to exchange for valuable goods or weapons, especially firearms from the Europeans. The acquisition of more modern weapons significantly altered the balance of power in the region, fueling widespread conflict and instability in African societies. Intertribal wars became more frequent and brutal, with the main objective of capturing prisoners to sell as enslaved people. Those sold into slavery were often individuals from ethnic groups different from their captors. This means there was no clear distinction between capturing traditional enemies or simply neighboring villagers, who could be neighbors, friends, or even relatives of the traders. In some cases, criminals or those considered undesirable within a community were also sold into slavery as a form of punishment or removal. Scholar Pernilla Ibsen, in her book Daughters of the Trade, offered profound insight into this complexity on the Gold Coast, modern-day Ghana. She revealed that Africans also participated in the slave trade through a unique form: interracial marriages, known as kasari. These marriages between African women and European traders created strong political and economic ties, facilitating the slave trade network. These women often played crucial intermediary roles, helping to bridge the two cultures and enable smooth commercial operations. It's important to understand that slavery in Africa before the arrival of Europeans was often very different in nature from transatlantic chattel slavery. In Africa, enslaved people could be integrated into their owner's family. They could buy land, own their own homes, and even advance in the military or other social structures. More importantly, this form of slavery was often not hereditary, meaning the children of enslaved people were not necessarily born into slavery. It was much more flexible and less dehumanizing than the form of slavery imposed by Europeans. However, as the demand for enslaved people from Europe rapidly increased, the nature of slavery in Africa also changed. The Portuguese, seeking large supplies, began pushing deeper into the African interior to abduct people, distorting traditional social and economic structures. Another noteworthy aspect is the understanding of the African elite regarding the fate of those sold. Initially, many Africans may not have fully known the exact conditions and brutality of the transatlantic slave trade. They might have imagined it similar to traditional African forms of slavery, where the fate of enslaved people could improve. However, the elite of the Kingdom of Dahomey, a powerful entity in West Africa, may have been very well aware of the brutal fate of those sold. Their diplomats traveled to Brazil and Portugal, witnessing firsthand what was happening, and some even experienced life as enslaved people in the Americas before finding ways to return home. This understanding further compounds the tragedy of their complex role. The Kingdom of Dahomey went so far as to declare that they only opposed the enslavement of Dahomey people. Anyone who did so would be executed. This shows a terrifying distinction in their perception of human rights and national interest. On the Gold Coast, the elite even took actions demonstrating deeper involvement. They sent their children to learn about the slave trade from the Europeans themselves, living in trade forts and even sailing with them. Some families even sent their children to Europe and the Americas for education, showing an astonishing level of cultural and economic exchange, even if it was built upon exploitation. However, while the elite might have had a deeper understanding, a terrifying rumor spread widely among African communities, especially those unaware of the true purpose of the transatlantic slave trade. They believed that Europeans were cannibals, a belief stemming from fear and lack of information about the fate of those who were taken away and never returned. This illustrates the information chaos and utter horror that African people faced. History also records the heartfelt pleas of African leaders. In a deeply moving letter, Afonso I Manicongo, a king of the Kingdom of Congo, begged King João III of Portugal to stop sending goods, especially weapons, that were fueling intertribal wars and the abduction of his people. Instead, he wished for the Portuguese king to send more missionaries to bring peace and enlightenment. Afonso I wrote about the widespread abductions, stating that it had left his country completely devastated. This letter is clear evidence that not all Africans condoned the slave trade, and there were strong dissenting voices from indigenous leaders themselves. What do you find most shocking about the role of Africans in the slave trade? Is it the fact that Africans themselves participated in selling their fellow people, or the desperate efforts of some leaders to stop this catastrophe? Resistance and forgotten uprisings. One of the most serious misconceptions history has propagated is the image of enslaved people as docile and submissive individuals, passively accepting their fate. However, the truth is far from it. In reality, there were countless uprisings and continuous acts of resistance against the brutal yoke of slavery. These courageous acts were not just beacons of hope in the dark night, but they also played an extremely important role in creating immense pressure, contributing to the abolition of the slave trade and ultimately slavery throughout the world. Let's delve into one of the most famous but often simplified stories of resistance: the Amistad Rebellion of 1839. This story began on the slave ship Amistad, carrying about 100 enslaved people. As the ship sailed near the coast of Cuba, an extraordinary event occurred. 53 newly abducted Africans united in a powerful rebellion, under the brilliant leadership of Joseph Cinque. They launched a daring attack, killing the ship's captain and cook. However, they spared the navigator's life with one condition: he must take them home to Sierra Leone, their homeland. Unfortunately, the navigator betrayed his promise. Instead of taking them back to Africa, he steered the ship north. 2 months later, the Amistad was intercepted by the U.S. Navy near Long Island, New York. This incident immediately became a focal point, creating significant political and legal impact on the abolitionist movement in America. It became a critical test for the American legal system regarding slavery and human freedom. In 1840, the U.S. Federal Court in Hartford, Connecticut, issued a historic ruling. The court declared that these Africans were not property. They were victims of kidnapping, and therefore they had the right to escape unlawful confinement. This was a resounding victory for the abolitionist movement, but the U.S. government did not accept it. They appealed to the U.S. Supreme Court. At the Supreme Court, a great figure emerged to defend the enslaved people, former President John Quincy Adams. With his exceptional experience and legal acumen, he fought tirelessly and achieved a glorious victory. The Supreme Court upheld the lower court's ruling, affirming the right to freedom for the Africans on the Amistad. Finally, in January 1842, 35 surviving Africans were helped to return to their homeland. The Amistad story is a powerful symbol of resilience and the struggle for freedom. However, in many stories of resistance, there's a crucial aspect often overlooked or deliberately erased: the overlooked role of women in uprisings. Scholars like Rebecca Hall have spent years researching to shed light on this truth, showing that enslaved women and female prisoners led many daring revolts on slave ships. A prominent example is the uprising on the ship the Unity in 1770, where women played a key role. Data from the Transatlantic Slave Trade database has provided astonishing evidence. It shows that uprisings actually occurred much more frequently than expected in about 1/10 of voyages. The most remarkable finding in this data is a unique statistical difference between ships with uprisings and those without. It was the number of women on board. The data indicates that the more women on board, the higher the likelihood of an uprising. The reason behind this truth is astounding. Enslavers and sailors often held a grave misconception. They did not consider women a potential source of danger. Therefore, women were often not as tightly shackled as men, and sometimes even allowed access to areas on deck where weapons or tools could be found. This underestimation proved to be a fatal mistake for many slave traders. Many enslavers lost their lives precisely because they underestimated the strength and will to resist of these women. The inspiring and courageous acts of resistance by women contributed greatly to the fight against slavery. Yet, sadly, these stories have been overlooked or erased for centuries, not mentioned in textbooks or mainstream historical narratives. Awareness of their role is essential for a full and fair understanding of the enslaved people's struggle for freedom. Legacy and the reparations debate. The transatlantic slave trade is not just a dark chapter in history, it's a disaster that has left a profound and lasting legacy, extending to this very day. One of the most horrific aspects of this legacy is the mass death and untold loss of life. Over 1 million people died during transport to the New World, and this number is just the tip of the iceberg regarding the total lives stolen. Canadian scholar Adam Jones did not hesitate to call the deaths of millions of Africans during this period a genocide. He described it as one of the worst catastrophes in human history, and argued that this killing and destruction was intentional, an inseparable part of a system designed to maximize profits with no regard for human life. However, there's another perspective from scholar Saidiya Hartman. She argues that the deaths of enslaved people, though tragic, were incidental to profit and served the development of capitalism. According to Hartman, death was not the primary goal of the system, but a direct and inevitable consequence of turning human beings into commodities, where the value of a life was determined by its labor capacity and the economic benefit it brought. Whether intentional or incidental to profit, its brutal nature remains unchanged. The legacy of slavery is particularly deep and complex in the United States. Slavery was not just a part of American history, it was the economic foundation of America. The massive plantations in the South, with their enormous output of cotton, tobacco, and sugarcane, relied entirely on enslaved labor. But it wasn't just the South. Even northern states, with their shipbuilding, finance, and processing industries, were heavily dependent on enslaved labor through funding, transporting, and processing plantation products. The initial wealth and development of the United States were built on this inhumane exploitation. Even after the Civil War and the abolition of slavery, this legacy continued to haunt America. During Reconstruction, and especially under Jim Crow laws, dangerous stereotypes about black people emerged and were perpetuated with the clear purpose of maintaining white supremacy. Systems of racial segregation, violence, and disenfranchisement continued to hinder the progress of African Americans for generations. Today, many argue that slavery has taken on a modern form: mass incarceration. The United States currently has the highest incarceration rate in the world, and alarmingly, black people are disproportionately represented in the justice system. Their labor in prisons is often used to produce goods and services, raising concerns about the continuation of legalized exploitation of labor. In light of these heavy legacies, there have been memorialization efforts and fervent debates about reparations globally. In 1998, UNESCO designated August 23rd as the International Day for the Remembrance of the Slave Trade and its abolition, a day for the world to remember the victims and historical lessons. In 2001, at the World Conference Against Racism in Durban, South Africa, African nations made a strong demand. They requested a clear apology from the former slave-trading nations. However, major powers like England, Portugal, Spain, the Netherlands, and the United States opposed issuing an official apology. The main reason for this opposition was reportedly concern about the massive financial reparations that might accompany such an apology. Nevertheless, memorialization efforts continue. Since 2009, the United Nations has worked to create a UN memorial to the victims of slavery at its headquarters, to commemorate the victims of the slave trade. Some countries have shown a willingness to confront their past. Brazil has apologized for its role in the slave trade, and the presidents of Ghana and Benin have also apologized for their nation's roles, demonstrating responsibility and remorse. In the United States, the debate over reparations remains heated. The reparations movement in the U.S. primarily focuses on descendants of enslaved people in America who bear the legacy of a brutal system. In 2009, the U.S. House and Senate passed a resolution apologizing for slavery, but this resolution also explicitly stated that it does not authorize, support, or serve as a settlement of any claim against the United States. President Obama at the time did not sign this resolution into law, stating that it could cause too much white resentment, reflecting the deep divisions in American society on this issue. Despite this, some organizations and individuals in the U.S. have begun to take concrete actions towards reparations. Georgetown University offered preferential admission to descendants of the 272 enslaved people they sold in 1838 to pay off debts. Brown University acknowledged its ties to the slave trade and planned commemoration and education to confront its past. Even the financial corporation J.P. Morgan Chase apologized and established a scholarship fund for black students in Louisiana, acknowledging the profits the institution gained from slavery. For a fuller and fairer understanding of this legacy, an important proposal has been made: the establishment of a Truth Commission on the Transatlantic Slave Trade. This commission would be tasked with unifying a consensual narrative about the scale, participants, beneficiaries, and sufferers of this trade. The commission should include scholars from Africa, Arab nations, and the West to ensure a multidimensional and fair perspective. Finally, another thought-provoking aspect related to the legacy is the issue of foreign aid to Africa. In the 50 years prior to 2009, aid amounted to over $1 trillion, a colossal sum. However, sadly, most of this money was misused or stolen, reducing its effectiveness in helping the continent overcome the difficulties that still linger from the past. In your opinion, what responsibility do we have in remembering and learning from historical tragedies like the transatlantic slave trade? What can we do to ensure such horrific mistakes never happen again? This is what daily life for an enslaved person in Virginia was like. What was daily life really like for an enslaved person in Virginia? It's a story often left in the shadows, filled with hardship, endurance, and quiet strength. Today, we're shedding light on the overlooked realities and remarkable resilience of those who lived through it. From grueling fieldwork to skilled trades, let's uncover the complex lives of enslaved Virginians, starting with labor beyond the fields. Diverse labor beyond the fields. When most people think about slavery, the first image that comes to mind is endless rows of cotton fields under a scorching sun. And while that was true in many parts of the South, life for enslaved people in Virginia was often much more complex and more varied than that. Sure, plantation fields were a big part of it, but enslaved labor stretched far beyond those fences. In fact, once the Transatlantic Slave Trade ended in 1808, enslaved people became even more essential in every corner of Virginia's economy. Picture the busy docks of a Virginia port. Enslaved men were hauling crates, unloading cargo, and working long days in the shipyards. Others stood knee-deep in the fishery, gutting and cleaning the day's catch for processing. Now shift the scene inland. Here, enslaved workers were sweating inside hot, noisy factories, rolling tobacco leaves, packaging goods, or preparing raw materials. Some were assigned to move produce from rural farms to the markets, acting as the unacknowledged muscle behind trade and transportation across the region. But it didn't stop there. Enslaved people were also skilled craftsmen. Many became expert coopers. Those are the folks who made barrels, which were absolutely essential for storing everything from flour and fish to whiskey and nails. Others were trained in tanning hides, making leather goods, or producing essentials like candles, soap, and textiles. These weren't easy jobs. They took time, precision, and strength. But the people forced into these roles didn't get to enjoy the benefits of their skills. Their talents were used to build someone else's wealth. So, yes, the image of fieldwork is powerful, but to understand the full truth, we need to see the bigger picture. Enslaved Virginians kept entire industries moving. Factories, ports, workshops, farms, and markets. And they did it all without freedom, recognition, or reward. Their labor was everywhere. It built the economy even though they were denied any part of it. The social hierarchy within enslaved communities. Now here's something that might surprise you. Even within the brutal system of slavery, there was a social order, an unwritten hierarchy among the enslaved themselves. This hierarchy didn't offer real power, but it did shape daily life, status, and survival. Blacksmiths, carpenters, coopers, and tanners. Their trades were essential to the plantation economy, so they were often more respected and sometimes even hired out for outside work. This gave them slightly more autonomy, but their labor still fully benefited their enslavers. Stable hands also held a unique position. Virginians took great pride in their horses and carriages, so those who cared for them were often trusted and occasionally granted special treatment, like sleeping in the stables rather than the overcrowded slave quarters. At the bottom were the field hands. They did the grueling labor of planting, weeding, and harvesting, working sunrise to sunset with little rest, poor housing, and the harshest punishment. This social order didn't change the fact that all were enslaved, but it did impact how people lived, how they were treated, and how they navigated the harsh reality of life on a plantation. Despite these divisions, enslaved communities often found ways to support one another, sharing food, stories, and quiet resistance that kept their dignity alive. At the top were house servants, those who worked inside the main house as cooks, maids, butlers, or nurses. They often wore better clothing, ate leftover food from the enslaver's table, and sometimes lived in attached quarters or nearby outbuildings. Being so close to the enslaver meant constant supervision and a greater risk of emotional or physical abuse. But it also gave them certain privileges that field hands never had. Next were skilled laborers, life in the slave quarters, work, food, and resistance. Let's take a step back from the fields and the workshops. What was daily life like when the workday was finally over? Back in the slave quarters? Well, to put it plainly, it was harsh. Cramped cabins, leaky roofs, dirt floors, and barely any privacy. These were the living conditions for most enslaved families in Virginia. On larger plantations like Thomas Jefferson's Monticello or George Washington's Mount Vernon, there were separate farms and work sites spread out over thousands of acres. That meant the quarters were scattered too, often grouped in clusters far from the main house. Most cabins were built from logs or rough timber with just one room for an entire family. There was no insulation, barely any furniture, and in winter, staying warm meant huddling around a small fire with smoke filling the room. It wasn't just uncomfortable, it was dangerous. As for food, breakfast usually came early in the morning, often just a bit of cornmeal or leftover scraps from the previous day. Enslaved workers would sometimes carry part of that meal into the fields and eat on the go whenever they could steal a quiet moment. The second meal, if they got one, didn't come until mid-afternoon. Hunger was a constant companion. But even in these conditions, enslaved people found ways to build community, share stories, and resist. Some resistance was quiet, like working slowly on purpose, pretending not to understand orders or breaking tools. These small acts of defiance were ways to reclaim just a sliver of control in an otherwise powerless situation. And then there were the bigger forms of resistance. Some enslaved people risked everything to escape. Others plotted revolts or spread forbidden news and ideas from one plantation to the next. That took bravery. It took hope. Even archaeologists have found surprising evidence of life in these quarters. Things like coins from Britain, Spain, and early America. That suggests some enslaved workers managed to earn tiny bits of money, maybe from side jobs or as rewards. It wasn't much, but it's proof that these folks found ways to survive, adapt, and hold on to their humanity no matter how brutal the system around them was. The slave quarters were designed to isolate, control, and break spirits. But within those cramped, rough cabins, enslaved families found ways to connect. They built communities, passed down culture, and nurtured strength that couldn't be taken from them. This part of history is not only about suffering, it's also a testament to human resilience, to the will to endure and the courage to remember. What do you think about life in a slave quarter? Share in the comments. Urban slavery and the rise of self-hire. When we think about slavery, we usually imagine it happening out in the countryside on wide, sprawling plantations. But in Virginia, especially as cities like Richmond began to grow, slavery didn't just stay rural. It moved right into the heart of the city. Urban slavery worked a bit differently. In towns and cities, enslaved people weren't out in the fields. They were in tobacco factories, iron foundries, warehouses, and workshops. Take the Tredegar Iron Works, for example. It became a huge supplier of weapons and equipment for the Confederacy during the Civil War. And it was built in large part by the forced labor of enslaved men. But here's something you might not expect. Most urban enslavers didn't actually own that many people. Not because they had a change of heart, but because they didn't have the space. Urban living meant tight quarters, small lots, and no room for big slave quarters. So instead of buying enslaved people, city merchants and business owners would rent them from nearby plantations. That gave rise to something pretty unusual. Some of the first commuters in American history. Every morning, groups of enslaved people would travel into the city to do their jobs. And then at night, they'd walk all the way back to their plantations. And because they were constantly at risk of being stopped or questioned, they had to carry passes, documents signed by their enslavers, showing they had permission to be out in public. If they didn't have those papers, they could be arrested, beaten, or worse. But out of this system, something rare emerged, a practice called self-hire. Some enslaved people had skills that were in high demand: blacksmiths, carpenters, coopers, and cooks. These individuals could sometimes strike a deal with their enslavers. The arrangement went like this. They'd go find their own work in town, earn their own wages, and then hand over a portion, usually the majority, of what they made. Whatever was left, they could keep. Now let's be clear, they were still enslaved. Their time wasn't their own, and they lived under constant threat. But compared to plantation life, this gave them something extremely rare, a small amount of control. They had to find their own food and shelter, manage their own schedules, and negotiate their own deals. In doing so, they built relationships across town, developed reputations, and sometimes, just sometimes, they saved enough money to buy their own freedom, or that of a loved one. Of course, this freedom frightened white authorities. As the number of self-hired workers grew, so did the anxiety. What if these skilled laborers organized? What if they helped others escape? In response, laws were passed to crack down: curfews, movement restrictions, and tighter surveillance from slave patrols. Still, for many enslaved people, self-hire was a lifeline. It offered a glimpse, just a glimpse, of what freedom could look like. And for some, it was a stepping stone on the long, dangerous road toward liberation. Plantation economy and the hiring out system. Now let's talk about something that really shaped the daily experience of enslaved people in Virginia: the plantation economy and what was known as the hiring out system. Plantations were everywhere in Virginia. Some were huge operations, practically self-sufficient communities that grew their own food, made their own goods, and relied on dozens, or even hundreds, of enslaved workers to keep everything running. The wealthiest enslavers didn't just grow crops. They built entire economies out of forced labor. But not everyone owned land that big. Smaller farms, often family-run, couldn't afford to keep enslaved people year-round. So what did they do? They rented them. Yes, enslaved people were hired out like tools or equipment. Bigger plantations would lease out workers during busy times, especially during planting and harvest seasons. Sometimes the payment came in cash, but other times it might be a portion of the crop, livestock, or other goods. It all depended on what could be traded. For the enslaved person, this system meant even more instability. Imagine being sent off to live and work with strangers for months at a time. No control over where you went, who you worked for, or how you'd be treated. And when the season was over, you were sent back to your original plantation, until it happened again. This wasn't just a side hustle for enslavers, it was big business. Wealth in Virginia wasn't just measured in acres of land, it was also measured in how many people you owned. And when money was tight, rather than selling an enslaved person outright, some enslavers made steady profits by hiring them out again and again. But here's the cruel twist: even when an enslaved person did hard labor for someone else, every penny earned still went into the enslaver's pocket. In rare cases, a small portion might be given to the enslaved individual. But most of the time, nothing. This system kept enslaved people constantly moving, constantly vulnerable, and always under someone else's control. Yet somehow they adapted, they learned new trades, they survived the disruptions, and they held on to what they could: family, faith, and the hope that something better was possible. The essential role of skilled labor: coopers and textile production. The backbone of Virginia's plantation economy that doesn't get nearly enough attention: skilled labor. Not every enslaved person was swinging a hoe in a field. Many were trained craftsmen, and without their expertise, the entire system would have struggled to survive. One group in particular played a massive role: the coopers. These were the men who made barrels, casks, and wooden containers of all shapes and sizes. Now, that might not sound all that impressive at first, but think about this. Just about every major product on a plantation had to be stored, preserved, or shipped. Flour, cornmeal, tobacco, whiskey, nails, salted fish, and meat. You name it. All of it needed containers. And those containers had to be strong, waterproof, and perfectly built to make it to market in one piece. That's where the coopers came in. Their job was highly technical and physically demanding. They had to shape wooden staves, fit them tightly, seal them with fire and water, and finish them with iron hoops. If even one barrel was off, goods could spoil or be lost in transit. In short, these men didn't just make barrels, they helped make plantation profits possible. But coopers weren't the only skilled laborers making a difference. By the early 1800s, plantations were starting to lean more heavily on textile production too. And guess who made that happen? Enslaved women and girls, mostly. At Thomas Jefferson's Monticello, for example, he converted what had once been slave housing into a full-blown textile workshop. Inside, enslaved workers spun cotton and wool, wove cloth, and prepared hemp fibers, all to produce clothing for the enslaved population itself. It wasn't just manual labor either. Jefferson actually invested in machines, spinning wheels, looms, and other equipment to turn raw materials into usable fabric. That tells you how important this work was to plantation self-sufficiency. It saved enslavers money, reduced dependence on outside suppliers, and gave them even more control over every aspect of enslaved people's lives. And here's the tragic irony. While these men and women developed real, marketable skills, ones that might have led to a decent living if they'd been free, they were never allowed to benefit from their own abilities. Their knowledge, their craftsmanship, their long hours of labor, they all served someone else's wealth. Still, they mastered these trades. They built reputations. They passed their knowledge down. And in some rare cases, that skill became a path toward bargaining for better treatment, or even freedom. We often focus on the physical hardship of slavery, but behind the labor were minds full of skill, precision, and craftsmanship. Enslaved artisans weren't just working with their hands, they were building, shaping, and solving problems every day. The plantation economy didn't survive on brute strength alone. It thrived because of their expertise. Alcohol production and control on plantations. Here's a part of plantation life that doesn't get talked about much. Alcohol. By the late 1700s, many Virginia plantations weren't just growing crops. They were brewing and distilling their own alcohol. And just like everything else, enslaved labor was at the center of that process. Enslaved people were trained to become brewers and distillers, learning the full craft from start to finish. They prepared the mash, fermented it, operated the stills, and monitored the entire brewing process. This wasn't easy work. It required a careful eye, patience, and real skill to make sure the final product was high quality and consistent. Alcohol wasn't just a luxury, it was a profitable product. Plantations used it to trade, sell, or even use as payment in some cases. So having enslaved workers who knew how to run the operation meant more money in the enslaver's pocket. And yet again, none of it went to the people actually doing the work. Now here's the strange and cruel contradiction. While enslaved people were the ones making the alcohol, they were often punished just for possessing it. Overseers had the authority to hand out harsh punishments if someone was caught drinking. In some cases, enslavers insisted that only they could approve whether an enslaved person could even have a sip. Rules varied from one plantation to the next. Some enslavers turned a blind eye to moderate drinking, especially during celebrations or holidays. Others cracked down hard, seeing any alcohol use as a threat to control and order. After all, an enslaved person with a little freedom or joy, even temporary, was something many white enslavers found threatening. Alcohol may seem like a minor part of plantation life, but it exposes deeper truths about control and exploitation. Enslaved people were skilled enough to produce high-quality spirits, yet they faced punishment for even possessing what they made. It's a stark example of slavery's cruelty, demanding talent, then using fear to keep that talent in chains. The demands of domestic service. Let's talk about the place where life looked fancier on the surface, but for enslaved domestic workers it came with a whole different kind of pressure. Working inside the enslaver's home wasn't a break from hardship. In fact, in many ways, it was even more demanding. Enslaved women and men who were assigned to domestic service had to be ready, day or night, to meet the needs of the enslaver and their guests. There was no off switch. If the household was awake, you were expected to be too. Laundering was one of the biggest, most exhausting tasks. Most plantation laundries were tucked away in outbuildings near the main house. That's where enslaved women, often alone or with just a few others, spent long hours scrubbing clothes, linens, tablecloths, anything and everything. There were no washing machines, no detergents, just hot water, lye soap, heavy wooden washboards, and raw effort. And once the washing was done, the clothes had to be dried, ironed, folded, and sometimes mended before being returned. It wasn't glamorous work, but it was essential. The enslavers expected everything to be spotless, pressed, and perfect. Domestic workers also served meals, cleaned rooms, made beds, polished silver, and cared for children. Some were even required to travel with the family when they went on trips, which meant being pulled away from their own loved ones for days, sometimes weeks at a time. no warning, no choice. And even though the work wasn't always as physically grueling as field labor, it was emotionally exhausting. House servants lived under constant watch, just steps away from the people who held total control over them. That proximity meant quicker punishment, tighter restrictions, and in many cases, a greater risk of exploitation. Sadly, enslaved women working in domestic service were especially vulnerable. Being inside the house didn't protect them. It often put them closer to danger. Many were subjected to physical and sexual abuse, and because of the brutal imbalance of power, there was little they could do to defend themselves or speak out. Domestic work might have seemed more polished from the outside, but it came with its own kind of burden. Enslaved workers in the household were expected to serve without pause, often under intense emotional pressure and constant supervision. Even the smallest moment of rest could be punished. Behind the clean floors and fine dishes was a life of relentless, invisible labor. Winter labor on the plantation. When we think about plantation life, we usually imagine hot summer days, sunburned fields, and long harvests under a blazing sky. But here's the thing, the work never stopped. Not even when winter rolled in. Cold weather didn't bring relief. It just brought different kinds of labor. Even in freezing temperatures, enslaved people were expected to be up before dawn. They'd huddle in their poorly heated cabins, maybe warm their hands over a dying fire, and then head out into the cold. Snow, sleet, rain, it didn't matter. The plantation still needed to run. In the winter months, tasks shifted. Instead of planting or picking crops, enslaved workers might be clearing land, repairing fences, tending livestock, or processing goods like tobacco and grains for market. Others chopped wood, hauled water, or fixed buildings damaged by the weather. There was always something to do, and it all had to be done under harsh conditions. One powerful example comes from George Washington's Mount Vernon. Just days before his death in December 1799, Washington got up early, despite a sore throat, and rode out on horseback in the middle of a sleet storm to inspect his farm. That image of a former president braving the cold to check on operations reminds us of just how demanding plantation life was, year-round. But let's not forget who made it all possible. While Washington was riding around, it was enslaved people doing the real work, slogging through mud, hauling materials, repairing infrastructure, all while facing freezing winds and long, dark days. There were no coats provided, no boots, no gloves, just layered rags and the will to survive. Winter also brought extra hardships inside the quarters. Keeping warm was a struggle. Fires were small, fuel was limited, and cabins were drafty. Illness spread easily. And for many, the cold months felt longer and heavier. Not just physically, but emotionally too. Anyone imagining that winter brought relief for enslaved people would be mistaken. The cold didn't pause the labor, it simply brought a different kind of hardship. The pace may have shifted, but the demands and the suffering continued without rest. But through it all, they endured. They adapted. And they found ways to keep going, even in the coldest, darkest parts of the year. Literacy, religion, and the suppression of education. In the early days of Virginia's history, religion wasn't just something you practiced on Sundays. It played a huge role in shaping how people thought about education, including the education of enslaved people. For some members of Virginia's elite, especially those influenced by Christian values, there was this idea that teaching enslaved people to read, just at a basic level, was actually a moral duty. The thinking was if enslaved individuals could read the Bible, they could learn religious principles like obedience, humility, and patience. At places like the College of William and Mary, religious instruction and literacy were sometimes even taught side by side. But that fragile tolerance didn't last. Everything changed in 1831 with the Nat Turner Rebellion. Turner was a literate, deeply religious enslaved preacher in Southampton County. One night, he led an uprising that shook Virginia to its core. The rebellion involved both enslaved and free black individuals, and in the chaos, around 60 white people were killed, including women, children, and even some enslaved domestic workers who had remained loyal to their enslavers. The revolt was quickly crushed by the Virginia militia and even the U.S. Navy. But the aftermath? That was devastating for any enslaved person who still held hope for education. The rebellion sent shockwaves through the South. White enslavers were terrified, and suddenly the same people who once saw literacy as a way to teach religion now saw it as a threat, a dangerous tool that could inspire rebellion, spread secret messages, and give enslaved people access to ideas they weren't supposed to have. In response, Virginia passed strict new laws. Teaching an enslaved person to read or write became a crime, punishable by fines, jail time, or worse. Other southern states followed suit. The goal was clear: to cut off access to knowledge and, with it, any chance of resistance or freedom. What once started as a religious obligation quickly turned into a source of fear. Literacy became a threat, something enslavers believed could spark rebellion. Enslaved people who had once been allowed to read scripture were now banned from even touching a book. Education, instead of offering hope, became something to suppress at all costs. Still, in the face of all this, many enslaved people found quiet ways to learn. They passed knowledge in whispers through songs, stories, and memory. Because even if the laws tried to take away their right to read, they couldn't take away their desire to know, to understand, and to be free. The path to freedom, apprenticeship, and the Underground Railroad. For most enslaved people, freedom felt impossibly far away, but there were rare moments, tiny cracks in the system, where opportunity appeared. Apprenticeship, a glimpse of opportunity. In rare cases, enslaved individuals were placed into apprenticeships with skilled tradesmen, learning carpentry, ironwork, leather crafting, or weaving. These weren't acts of kindness, but business arrangements. Enslavers saw value in training enslaved people to boost their worth or rent them out at higher prices. While still under ownership, apprentices were usually fed, housed, and trained by the craftsmen. Sometimes, if they were lucky, they could earn small wages or tips. And in a few rare instances, these skills became bargaining tools, opening the door to buy their own freedom or that of a loved one. The Underground Railroad, a secret path to freedom. For those with no legal way out, the Underground Railroad offered a dangerous but powerful alternative. It was a secret network of safe houses and brave individuals, both black and white, who helped enslaved people escape to the north. Because Virginia bordered free states like Ohio, it became a critical route. Escaping meant risking your life, but many took the chance. Some were helped by others still enslaved, who fed and sheltered them in silence. It wasn't just a physical journey, it was a leap of faith, fueled by courage, resilience, and the belief that freedom was worth everything. Maintaining African culture and facing harsh realities. Despite everything, despite the pain, the punishments, and the constant surveillance, enslaved people in Virginia didn't lose their identity. In fact, they held on tightly to the roots of their culture, passing it from one generation to the next, even in the most brutal conditions. Oral traditions, keeping memories alive. Even without books or formal schooling, enslaved people in Virginia found powerful ways to keep their culture alive. Through stories, songs, and shared memories, they passed down the traditions of their African roots. Every night around fires or inside crowded cabins, elders told folktales that taught lessons and kept heritage alive. Songs, especially spirituals, carried double meanings. They spoke of faith on the surface, but underneath they whispered of escape, survival, and freedom. These oral traditions connected generations, gave people hope, and preserved identity in a world designed to erase it. The harsh reality of punishment. But alongside this strength was a brutal truth. Life under slavery meant constant fear of punishment. A missed task, a look, even just being in the wrong place at the wrong time, could lead to beatings or worse. Runaway slave ads often described scars, brands, or missing fingers, evidence of past abuse. Some enslavers gave full power to overseers, while others kept punishment under their own control. Either way, violence was a tool, used to intimidate, dominate, and control. Yet in the face of this cruelty, enslaved people still resisted, still remembered who they were, and still held on to the hope of freedom. The slavery during the Civil War and the dawn of Reconstruction. The Civil War marked a turning point, not just for the country, but for enslaved people across Virginia. As the war raged, enslaved people in Confederate-controlled areas were still forced to work, this time for the military. Some dug trenches, built fortifications, or cooked for soldiers. Their status was uncertain. Many were labeled as contraband, not quite enslaved anymore, but not truly free either. Everything changed in 1863 when President Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation. It declared freedom for enslaved people in Confederate territories. But for many, that freedom was slow to arrive and came with serious challenges. After the war ended, the period known as Reconstruction began. And while slavery was officially over, life was far from easy. Most formerly enslaved people had no land, no money, and no education. Many ended up in sharecropping arrangements with the same landowners who had once enslaved them, keeping them trapped in poverty. Still, they pushed forward. They built churches, opened schools, reunited families, and laid the foundation for future generations. It wasn't the end of struggle, but it was a new beginning. Out of pain came persistence. And from centuries of injustice came a powerful, unstoppable desire to reclaim dignity, freedom, and hope. Their days were filled with pain and perseverance, but also quiet strength and unbreakable spirit. Enslaved people in Virginia didn't just endure, they shaped history. Thank you for watching. Please share this video so that the story of the unwavering resistance of enslaved people and the hidden truths about the scale and roles of all parties can be spread more widely, reaching more people. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and hit the bell so you don't miss our next journeys into forgotten historical stories and valuable lessons from the past that we must remember to build a more humane future.